Testing. 1 2 3 1 2 3. Can y'all hear me okay? Let me see if this thing got wigged. Hello, chat. I have missed thee. Oh my god, this thing is so laggy. Okay, whatever. We'll just deal with it. So welcome, chat, to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Alok Kanoja. I'm a psychiatrist practicing in Boston. Just a reminder that everything we discuss today is intended to be for educational purposes only, and nothing is intended to be taken as medical advice. Hold on a second. This thing is laggy. No. Let me try to figure this out. So if you guys have a medical question, concern, please go see a licensed professional and, get yourself evaluated, get some treatment for yourself, etc. So welcome to stream, y'all. So I know our schedule has been a little bit off. I think some of y'all may have heard by now that I'm actually in Europe, and I have the privilege of working with evil geniuses to prepare them for the international. So it's been an honor, and I'd love to just share some thoughts with you guys. So the first thing that a lot of people don't know is I've actually been working with them all year, and so far it's been an awesome journey. And I think already it's sort of a W in my column, or it feels like a win to me. So I think the players have gotten a lot better. Evil geniuses last couple years, they've been kind of, they've been doing well and performing well, but they've sort of managed to kind of swing somewhere between 3rd and 8th place at most of the major events. And they made it to the grand finals of 2 events in a row. So super happy about that. This is the big one. And I think the tricky thing about the international is that it's, it's such a big prize pool. It's such a big tournament. And I honestly think that Dota's the one sport where, like, you never know what's going to happen at TI. And so it's been awesome working with an esports team so intensively for the past year. I think I'm going to share with you all some of what I've learned today. But I think the first thing to kind of remember is that there's a big paradox in performance, which is that the harder you care, the harder you try, in a sense, or the more that you try to win, the harder it actually becomes to win. So this is a principle that's actually very common in meditation, and also people have done studies on the flow state. And what they've sort of discovered is that the harder you try to get into the flow state, the more you try to get into the flow state, the harder it becomes to achieve the flow state. That the flow state is actually a happening, it's not an effort. And what you need to do is kind of like get into the zone, and getting into the zone, if you sit down and you say, okay, now I'm going to get into the zone. Now I'm going to get into the zone. Now I'm going to get into the zone. You actually don't get into the zone, right? The zone is like, it's like a flower that blooms. It's like a blooming. It's a happening. It's a result. It's not something that you can do. It's not an action. So another good example of this is going to bed versus falling asleep. So like you can go to bed, but the harder you try to force yourself to sleep, the more difficult it becomes. So I think that's what's really tricky, is like, how do you consistently help people get into the zone and kind of, because you can sort of train it, but you can't like teach it, if that sort of makes sense. So that's been kind of an interesting journey. Personally, what I've really enjoyed about it is just watching what works and kind of what doesn't. How do you help someone consistently perform in a situation where, like, there are tons of good teams, and like you can't ever, predict like a high percentage chance to win a Dota tournament, right? Like if you look at, I saw that there have been some calculations and all these esports betting sites and stuff like that. Like, they'll perform all these calculations and people will run tests and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, at a competitive tournament, where, especially in esports, where like the difference between the number 1 team, the number 2 team, the number 3 team, the number 4 team is actually like very, very small. You can't consistently predict like who the winners are, right? I think TI8 is kind of a good example of that. TI9 arguably was, maybe you could predict, but I think it's just been neat to see. So I've really enjoyed kind of being able to test a lot of my theories about performance. I've enjoyed being able to learn from this team. It's been like an amazing learning experience, because I want y'all to kind of think about, or just, when I think about it, like I've had an amazing opportunity to work with a lot of high performers. And what I'm curious about is, like, at the end of the day, you can look at finance, you can look at trading, you can look at the practice of medicine, you can look at streaming, you can look at esports, or you can look at a 25-year-old who's like in their mom's basement, or you can look at a student at a community college, you can look at a student in medical school, you can look at all of these people. At the end of the day, like, they're all human. So what's been really awesome to see is, like, how can you work on the human element that is independent of, like, what the task is? And are there some principles of performance that transcend a given, like, industry or job? And so it's been awesome to work with these people and essentially, like, try to answer that question. So I've been really grateful for the opportunity. The team has been fantastic. I really enjoy spending time with them. It's frankly a lot of fun. And personally, as like someone who's a fan of Dota, it's so fascinating, like, how different watching a team prepare and how they, like, think and draft is from what most noobs like myself think. And I think it's really cool that, Dota especially is, like, such a deep game, and, like, the kind of thinking that goes into it. I think there's a massive amount of, like, Dunning-Kruger that goes on, right? Is, like, you have a lot of people, like, the internet will never hesitate to share an opinion, because people, like, our brains are not really designed to tell us what we don't know. So, like, back 10,000 years ago, or 100,000 years ago, or 1,000,000 years ago, when human beings used to go forage, like, their brain doesn't tell them objectively, you have no idea what's out there and you have no idea what you're going to find. So our brain is designed to help us and make us think that we know what's going on when we actually have no clue. And so it's kind of interesting. It's been interesting to see, how people will make judgments and with a lot of ignorance. So there's been a lot of, like, it's been just a wonderful personal journey to get to know people, to get to, be invested in them. One of the things that I don't really get to do very much anymore is, like, work with people long term, just because of streaming and stuff. We'll do interviews and stuff like that. But it's really cool to, like, work with people over the course of the year and, like, watch them grow. It's been a real test to take my attitude of, like, letting go of the outcome and focusing on the action. It's like a real roll of the dice, and I think EG has been an awesome organization in terms of, like, taking that chance. Because if you kind of think about it, it's like one of the most meme-ish things to do, which is, like, going to a team and saying, like, hey, don't try to win, try to play the best game possible. And it's like an interesting mindset shift, which we talk about a lot, right? Like, so I'll say, don't worry about getting an A, worry about studying. And so the team has taken a lot of chances, frankly, in working with me and trying to implement things that are, like, different in esports. But overall, it's been an awesome journey. Like, I've learned so much. It's been really cool to see, like, what theories I have work and what theories I have don't work. And, it's been interesting because I think a lot of times, hold on a second. Okay. A lot of times, like, experts like myself will, like, go into places, right? Because, like, I'm an expert and I know so much about human psychology. And then I'll show up with all these theories, and, like, the theories will be, like, useless. And I think this is where sometimes you'll go get an MBA, right? And, like, you've been in a bunch of classrooms and you've done a bunch of test cases and things like that. And then you try to start a company and you, like, fail epically. And so it's been a really awesome learning experience for me to see, like, theoretically, okay, like, this is what I think they need to be doing, and, like, they need to think this way and do that, and everyone needs to meditate and Ayurveda and all this kind of crap. And to actually go in and be humbled by, like, how ignorant I am about, what's actually effective and what isn't. And it's fun. It's been amazing to, walk a journey with a group of people who are, like, interested in figuring it out, right? So we're there. We don't know what works. They have no idea, like, what I can do or whether it's going to be effective. And it's just a process of, like, working with someone towards a goal and, like, not getting, stuck around setbacks or things like that. So Yeah, so what I'm actually going to do in a second, I think there's some. You going to stay? Okay, let's stay. Okay. So there are a couple things we want to do today. So a couple of just quick announcements. So just a reminder that like streams are going to be kind of all over the place. I may stream one day next week. I'm going to try to stream tomorrow. So stay tuned to our Instagram and our Twitter and stuff for when we stream. We may try something a little bit different tomorrow. I don't know. It's going to be like a little bit all over the place. So apologies for that. Just stay tuned. And, if you guys are able to come hang out, like awesome, just come and hang out. We'll chill for a little while. Like I can't really make promises on when exactly we'll stream. We're going to do our best to try to stream tomorrow sometime around now. And then maybe Wednesday of next week. But there's, it's pretty flexible, or it's like pretty fluctuant, I should say, not really flexible. Just because there's also an evolving like COVID situation and things like that. So our flights and stuff have to be like changed and things like that. And we have to get like PCR testing and all this sort of stuff. So, we're try to stay tuned, chat. I love y'all. I miss y'all. And I'm sorry that I can't be quite as regular as we usually are. So yeah, for those of you who don't know, like Romania actually has like a huge spike in COVID cases. So we're trying to be safe. So a couple of also just announcements if y'all don't know. We had a batch of new personal coaching slots, which has been pretty full, open up on September 27th, so just a few days ago. If some of y'all have been waiting in line for personal coaching, I think we just trained 25 coaches and they basically like filled up right away. Outcomes seem to be really good. People seem to be really happy. We're in the process of preparing a manuscript for publication, a peer-reviewed publication. So all y'all will be able to see kind of from a research side, like what coaching actually does and how effective it is. Obviously based on internal data and being like really happy and getting a lot of feedback, we continued the program. Like we would, if it was not working, we probably would shut it down. But so personal coaching seems to be really effective. Group coaching is also really effective. We still have group coaching slots available. A little bit about the difference. So if you guys are interested more in skills building, accountability, and like learning stuff, then I think group coaching is actually a better fit. If you're interested in, one-on-one work where someone can very like individually help you with your problems, personal coaching is a better fit. Both group coaching and personal coaching have good outcomes in terms of giving people a greater sense of control over their life, helping people build a sense of purpose, and reducing other things like depression and anxiety by significant amounts. It's our belief it's not a treatment, right? So it's not designed to treat depression or anxiety, but part of our philosophy at Healthy Gamer is that there are ways to treat your mental health that don't involve like medical treatment. So if you think about obesity, for example, you can take medications for obesity. You can have gastric bypass surgery, which are medical interventions, which will improve the medical condition of obesity. At the same time, you can also have non-medical interventions, which are very effective and arguably even like healthier, right? So things like exercise, nutrition, diet, those kinds of interventions can be actually like in the long term more, healthy than even the medical interventions. And I believe that some of that is true in terms of like mental health stuff too. So as a psychiatrist, I do prescribe medication, but I'd say about 25 to 30% of my patients are on medication. I tend to be pretty aggressive about, helping people try without medication once they really establish their life in other ways. And so it's been my experience that ultimately, like, even taking antidepressant medication, while it works wonderfully for some people, it does predispose you to a couple of side effects and things like that. So that's why I think if we really look at, psychiatric treatment, there's a reason why antidepressants and things like that are first line, right? Because they do consistently help people. But I think that as a society, we need to be a little bit more aware of like non-medication treatments, or even non-treatment things for our mental health. I think as a society, we understand very well that, for example, like physical health is more than medical treatment, right? If you look at like people who want to lose weight, the first thing that they think of is usually not gastric bypass surgery or gastric sleeve surgery. The first thing that they think of is like exercise and diet. Whereas something tricky has happened in our society, which is that when people feel depressed and anxious, a lot of times the first thing that people will tell them is like, oh, you should go see a therapist, which can actually be a good thing. I'm not against doing it. But I think there's more to mental health than treating mental illness. And so our coaching program is really designed to help that aspect, which I think is underdeveloped in our society. So if y'all are interested in that kind of stuff, by all means, sign up for coaching. So today, what I'd like to do is share a couple of thoughts with y'all. The first is on a very high level, how I think about performance. So having worked, having consulted at startups, having worked with C-suite executives, having worked at investment banks, having worked at major tech companies in terms of like optimizing their performance, working with like content creators, physical athletes like NFL players, football players, things like that. And also working with like students and medical students, things like that. What I've come to realize, and now having worked very intensively with an esports team, I've done work with esports for the last 3 years, but this is definitely like the most intensive engagement. What I've kind of realized is that like it boils down to 4 things. And what I'd like to do today is share what I would call the 4 pillars of performance. And this is where, if we kind of take a step back, like it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is that at the end of the day, you can be an esports professional, a physical athlete, a student, a parent, or like a CEO. And at the end of the day, you're human, right? So the common element is not the industry, it's the human. So what can we understand from a human perspective, from a personal perspective, that will translate into success in any of those fields? And too often, I think what we have is like, we have like industry-specific results. Like we have industry-specific like performance improvement, right? So for example, there'll be someone who specializes as a sports psychologist, and they have a lot to offer, don't get me wrong. You'll have someone who specializes in like, physical sports. You'll have, people who specialize as like consultants for, investment banks, or like consultants for like IT solutions or things like that. So we'll have a lot of like industry specific support, which is wonderful and it's very effective. Don't get me wrong. But I think what's actually missing is somewhat more of like understanding on a fundamental level what works in all of the industries, right? And in my experience, like the common element is the fact that they're humans. And if we look at humans, sure, humans can be quite different. But if we look at humans, what we see at the end of the day is that the similarity between 2 humans is greater than the difference. We all have 1 brain, 2 eyes, for the most part, 2 nostrils, a mouth, 1 heart, 2 lungs, 2 kidneys, 1 stomach. And so there's a lot of similarities between humans. Our brains are all wired a certain way. Like we all have occipital cortices. We all have frontal lobes. And so there are common elements of performance, which I think transcend any industry. And the other thing that I'd like to share with y'all kind of my idea of like the 4 pillars of performance. So the other thing to kind of think a little bit about and why I sort of divided it into 4 pillars is to understand that in my experience, when people are looking to improve, they tend to focus on one of these things and neglect the others. So what I'm going to do is share with y'all what I think the 4 pillars of performance are, and then also go through 2 examples. One is a student and one is a programmer of like how to apply like these ideas. And in my experience, what tends to happen is that people will get like hyper focused on one of the 4 pillars and they'll keep on trying to improve that, but that there's like a diagnostic problem. So people will like diagnose themselves as like, they'll only look at one of these 4 things and they'll keep on trying to improve that. And then they end up getting frustrated because they don't think about these other dimensions. So, here are the 4 things that I think it essentially comes down to. The first is preparation. So this is like what you do that sets you up in a long-term sense for performance on a given day. So this can be like studying, for example, like for a test, right? How you prepare for the test will result in performance for the test. As a programmer, this could have a lot to do with, for example, where you went to school, if you went to school, what kind of certifications you have, what your work experience is. So like, did you work at this company for this amount of time or this company for this amount of time? And I know like a lot of y'all are thinking like, oh, isn't my performance on a test, like, doesn't it depend on how much I study? Like, isn't that, because that's what we sort of think of, right? Which is exactly the point, which is there's way more to it than just how you study. So preparation is definitely a huge part. And generally speaking, when we think about performance, I think preparation is the first and unfortunately oftentimes the only thing that people think about. So then what happens is when they do poorly on the test, like people get frustrated and they say like, oh, I need to study more, I need to study more, I need to study more. The second pillar is going to be adaptation. So this is where when I look at people who are successful across different fields, what I see is that there's like a big difference between like the winners and the losers. And it's that the winners know how to adapt and the losers sort of don't. So I'll give you guys kind of a quick example of this. So as a student, you know, if I like do poorly on a math test, what a lot of people will do is like conclude and they'll say like, I'm not good at math. And they'll sort of like determine some sense of identity around poor performance. The tricky thing there is that sense of identity of I'm not good at math or I'm not a math person or, you know, something like that. Like I can't cook is a good example. Another thing that I hear, you know, a lot. People will say like, oh, like I just can't cook. Like it's not something that I'm good at. So when people will make essentially identity determinations based on performance, they stop adapting, right? So once you say like, I can't cook, there's nothing you can do about that. Like if you say I'm bad at math or, you know, if some people will also like in the dating world, they'll say like, I'm ugly. So that's just GG, right? It's like over, like I can't do anything about it. And so there's a fundamental lack of adaptation. And if you look at the difference between some, you know, you can have two people who are ugly, but the difference between one who winds up in a healthy relationship and one who stays alone is not the ugliness, because that's, I mean, ugly people are in relationships all the time. I'm not trying to be mean, but I'm just sort of meeting them where they're at and sort of assuming that that's an accurate physical characterization. What I'm saying is that there's, you know, you can take any kind of identifier of the self, like ugliness or I'm stupid or I'm bad at math. And what you'll find is that like of all of the people who at one point identified as being bad at math, some of them will actually be very successful in fields that require math, right? And the big difference is their capacity to adapt. So someone's saying I'm low IQ. So here's what I'll tell you. I've worked at a lot of startups and places where there are very stupid people at the top, and they can still be really, really successful, right? So like, for example, leadership is a good example where you don't need to be smart. You just need to be good at managing people who are smart, right? So that doesn't need to hold you back. I'm low IQ is also a prime example of exactly the kind of thinking that I'm talking about. So people who don't have an adaptive mindset will label themselves with something that is unchangeable. They'll say, I'm ugly, I have a low IQ. It's like a thing that is like fixed, right? And so then it's like, you're screwed. Like, I'm just bad at Dota. It's like, GG, game over. There's nothing you can do about it. So that dooms you to like low performance once you start thinking about it that way. So this is exactly why adaptability is a huge part of this, right? It's the ability to, adaptation is not about like changing who you are. It's about accounting for who you are and not letting that get in the way of your performance. So the third pillar that we're going to talk about is communication. So I think irrespective of what field you're in, or I guess there are a few cases where this isn't true, but I'd say for like, 99% of people, that communication is a skill that transcends any industry. And that what I've seen is that people who perform well in a particular field are tend to be good communicators. So you can have two doctors, for example, who have comparable IQs, comparable test scores, and comparable training. And there's a big difference in how well they do in the workplace. And if you've worked in medicine in any way, shape, or form, you'll know this, that like the doctors who get along with other people are the ones that are going to have have a better time and do a better job. So there are some doctors, for example, that are very arrogant, and they can still rise in positions of power, but like if they're the more arrogant they are and the worse they are at communicating, like the more abusive they are to their underlings and their nursing staff, like the worse they end up doing. And that, you know, generally speaking, the best people in the hospital are the ones that like you can communicate with. So, you know, if there's some asshole doctor that you're consulting and they're like a pain to work with, then like you're not going to want to work with them. And then like there's a part of your mind that's going to be thinking about that, and they're going to be like mean to you. And so like it doesn't, and the patient is the one who suffers. And I've worked with some doctors that are just excellent communicators, and like they're, by virtue of their communication skills, their actual output improves. And so this is also true whether you're looking at C-suite executives or students even. And we'll kind of go into a lot of examples for students and even programmers. This is actually really, really important for programmers, especially because there's this idea that like programmers like don't communicate, right? Like we're all about sitting in front of our computer screens and typing things out. Whereas what I've seen when I work with clients who work like, you know, work at places like Google and Amazon and Microsoft and stuff like that, is that the programmers that are very good at communicating, like if you guys have worked with good product, project managers, for example, or like a product dev team, that communication is like absolutely vital to a good product. There's also, I forget whose law it is, but you know, there's a law that says that the number of programmers that you have working on a project is inversely correlated with the speed of the project. So if I have 5 programmers that it's going to take 1 year for them to build a product, and I add 5 more people to the project, it actually, the time doesn't reduce, it actually increases to like 2 years. So this is kind of it's sort of a meme, but I think there's actually a lot of reality to this. And I think essentially what it comes down to is like communication. So our third pillar is going to be good communication. And if you're good at communicating, you're going to like do better no matter what field you're in. There are a couple of exceptions to this, I imagine. Like, you know, I've heard, for example, that like Enya, who's, you know, makes music, she's like very isolative. I've never talked to her. These are all rumors. I don't know if this is true. But I imagine that there are some creative pursuits and some examples of like, you know, authors that like historically will like go into the woods and like hang out in a cabin for a while. And they'll kind of be isolated, and maybe that supports creative output. Maybe they don't need to communicate much. But generally speaking, I'd say 99% of people that I've worked with need to be good communicators. The last thing, and I know it's kind of weird that I say this for last, is mindset. So at the end of the day, what is in your mind when you set out to do a task drastically alters how successful you are. So, you know, I'll just give you guys kind of an example from my experience. So like most of what we do here at Healthy Gamer is mindset. So we'll kind of review some Reddit posts and stuff like that. You guys, we kind of like, this is our bread and butter. But I think, you know, even when I play a Dota game, like there's like a mindset that you can have of going in. So a lot of people will say that if you want to win in like, you know, Climb and Dota or like League of Legends, the first thing you should do is like mute all other players, right? And so I think that sort of makes sense in some ways. But in my experience, actually, like trying to communicate with people, and I know I'm sort of talking about communication, actually works pretty well if you get good at it, right? But well, the reason I bring it up in terms of mindset is like if you go into the game of Dota with the assumption that all communication is bad, then it's going to sort of create a situation where like communication is unsuccessful. So mindset is incredibly important. If you go into a game of Dota thinking like, oh, I can actually try to communicate with my teammates, and I know what all y'all are saying. Y'all are saying, lol, I've tried that. It doesn't work. GG, noob. You can't communicate with these animals. And I think that mindset is actually like destroying your ability to communicate. So there's overwhelming research, for example, that there's this thing called the placebo effect. And what the placebo effect is, it's really bizarre, but if a human being thinks that something can work, it actually objectively increases their likelihood of it working. Now, there may be some interesting exceptions to that. So, for example, like maybe in gambling, like it doesn't really matter what you think. I don't know. I'm not really sure. But in most industries and definitely in like scientific studies, like we know that giving someone the same medication, the results of that medication or the effect of that medication is going to be altered by the mindset of the person. And so these are kind of our 4 pillars of performance. And now, having worked with a bunch of industries, I think it basically comes down to these 4 things. So preparation, adaptation, communication, and mindset. So the next thing that we're going to do is go over 2 examples. So we're going to run through the case of a student and the case of a programmer. And we're going to kind of talk a little bit about how each of these things impacts these 2 people's lives. So I picked these 2 examples because these are, examples of people that I've worked with, like a lot of people in these industries. So I feel pretty confident about what I'm about to share with y'all. So the first thing to understand is that, generally speaking, like I said, people have a diagnostic problem. So most people who struggle with something will look for solutions, not look for problems. And I know that sounds kind of weird, but if I'm failing math, right, I'm not going to Google, how do I figure out why I'm failing at math? What I'm going to Google is, how do I succeed at math? How do I get better at math? So the first thing that we have to understand, which I think is a huge societal problem in terms of thinking, is that we jump straight to treatments without understanding diagnosis. Because if you're bad at math and then you kind of say, how do I study better? The problem may not be studying, right? There could be all kinds of other interventions that you have which will allow you to succeed at math that have nothing to do with studying. Maybe studying isn't the problem. So let's kind of talk about prep, because that's where studying is. So, there are some efficient ways of studying, and that, if you prepare appropriately, if your preparation is good, it will lead to a better result. This may be super simple when it comes to studying, but basically the more you study, at a very high level, the more you study, the more likely you are to succeed. So, the kind of preparation that you do is going to be also important. So this is where, okay, so let's just say on a high level, the more you study, the better you do. But this is where it's important to remember that preparation is not just about brute forcing it, right? So one of the big theories that I have in esports, for example, is that mindlessly grinding pubs does not make you better. So in the same way, I think mindlessly studying does not make you better. So if practice is all it would take to improve, then we should see a clear correlation between the number of games played and your skill at a particular game. But we know, if you guys have played Valorant or League of Legends or Dota or anything, you know that there are people out there who have played 10,000 games who are lower ranked than people who have played 1,000 games. And so if we kind of think about it, how the hell does that actually work, right? It's a very, very eye-opening revelation that brute practice does not equal results. And so a lot of times what we'll do is, if I do poorly on a test, what am I going to say to myself? Oh, I did poorly because I didn't study enough. I studied 2 hours a day and I should have studied 4 hours a day. So we default to making preparation one-dimensional and brute forcing it. So there's been a lot of research on deliberate practice, right, which is a mindful or intentional practice. So back when I was tutoring people in the MCAT, which is the medical college admissions test, it's the standardized test that you have to take to get into medical school, I had a big revelation, which was you can take a bunch of practice tests and up to a point, it will improve your score. But then what I noticed is that some people would top out, essentially. And that despite taking more and more practice tests, their scores were not improving. And then what I kind of realized is that this is kind of interesting, because they may study more. So they may do poorly in a particular subject. So they'll go and read the chapter again, but that doesn't actually improve their performance. And essentially what these people need to do is sit down. And this is essentially what I did myself and what I taught other people to do, is look at why did you get the questions that you got right? And why did you get the questions that you got wrong? Right? What is the reason for the question, you got this question right and the question, you got this other question wrong? So as a student, a lot of times what I find people will do is just increase their studying time, or they default to increasing their studying time. But actually being a little bit more thoughtful about the way that you study can actually be very, very helpful and actually lead to an improvement in your test scores. So other examples of like optimization like this, so these are examples that I would put into preparation, are memory, like taking advantage of memory consolidation. So memory consolidation is OP. So a lot of people, for example, will cram the night before the test, or what they'll do is like have these marathon study sessions of like 8 hours at a stretch, right? Whereas like when I was in medical school, what I would do is basically study for 2 hours a day and then like take advantage of memory consolidation by taking a nap in the afternoon. So I would have, colleagues who would like wake up at 8 a.m. and they'd like study from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. because the more hours you study, the better you're going to do. And what I tended to find is that I'd study for 2 hours a day, I'd take a nap, and then I'd wake up and I'd like chill a little bit, and I'd studied for a couple more hours maybe, and when preparing for a test. But on average, I only studied for 2 hours a day, and those 2 hours were like ideal studying kind of systems. And so as you ideally study, like you actually don't need to study more. You can study less and still get a good grade. So I think there's a lot of sophistication, and you can take advantage of a lot of physiology and neuroscience and psychology to improve your actual preparation. So other good examples of this is like when I work with traders, for example, like I'll sometimes get, consulted by a group of traders. And what they'll all do their kind of research and stuff, but like doing research on your own and doing like 10 hours of research, or 10 hours versus 20 hours of research, you may not get a whole lot out of 20 hours of research. And what I actually found when I worked with like day traders and things like that is that, for example, spending 5 hours trading and 1 hour discussing what you've learned with your colleagues leads to an improvement of performance over 6 hours of just doing research, right? So there's some things that you can do to optimize your preparation beyond brute force. So that's the preparation category. So we talked a little bit about study habits. And so what, the key thing here, once again, is like when people think like, oh, I just need to study more, that may not be correct. You may actually be studying more. You may be studying enough. It's just the nature of your studying may not be like optimal in some ways, or it's not even about optimal. It may actually be like horribly deficient in some ways. And another good example of this is that a lot of students, when they study, they'll just passively read instead of like taking notes. And even their notes will be like very passive. So what I recommend to students who want to learn actually is to like, read, let's say, a chapter and then sit down with a blank piece of paper and write out what you understood about the chapter. Because this is the key thing that people don't understand about like a test. So the skill that you need for a test is information recall. It's not like information going in. So there's actually like a difference between recalling stuff that's implanted and like putting stuff in. So it's actually more efficient to, instead of read a chapter twice, to read it once and then spend time actually trying to recall it. So then what you're actually doing is like, that's training the skill of information recall. And then when you try to recall it and you try to write down like all the key concepts, then when you go back to the chapter at hand and you kind of like look at, and then what you do is you're like very focused, right? Because you're going to say, okay, the second time I read the chapter, I'm going to see what did I miss and what did I get? Okay, I got that. Oh, I missed this. And then you don't jot it down there. Oh, I missed this. Okay, let me close the book. Let me take a brand new sheet of paper and let's see if I can put everything down. And so you're actually practicing exactly what you're going to need to do during the test. And so when people start to study in a situation like that, it improves their preparation and their grades go up. The second thing that we're going to talk about is adaptation. So for students, like I was saying, a lot of people will claim a particular identity around something, like I'm bad at math, or I'm just not good at studying, or these kinds of things. And so what I want y'all to understand, this is really important, is that there's a big difference between successful people and non-successful people. And that big difference essentially has to do with like what they do when they fail. So for unsuccessful people, what they tend to do is they'll say like, I am a failure, or they'll make some attribute of their identity instead of adapting. So instead of concluding that I'm bad at math, the question that you should ask yourself is, what can I do to get better at math? What can I do to get a better grade here, right? And it's such a huge problem, not only within our community, but within society as a whole. You can ask people like all the time and they'll make like all these kinds of interesting statements about themselves that define who they are. Oh, I'm just not good at relationships. Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. That's just the way that I am. Like if you can't, like, I'm just someone who sometimes loses my cool. Yeah, like I just like sometimes when I get drunk, I do stupid things. Sorry. And so these are people who, when faced with failure, don't ask themselves the question, how can I actually be better at this? There's a complete lack of adaptation. And so as a student, if you do poorly in a class, it sort of doesn't matter whether you did good or you did poorly. The main question that you need to ask yourself is, how can I do better, right? What can I do differently? And so when I work with top tier esports teams, and y'all will see this if you watch tournaments, is like some teams will be one trick ponies. And then like they can get like halfway through the tournament, but they can't make it to like, they'll come in with like a very clear strategy that they practiced and drilled a ton. But it's the teams that are able to adapt that are the ones that consistently go the long distance. And that's also true in life. Like you can look at people who will get hamstrung by a particular thing. It's like if I just say that I'm bad at math and I'm good at these other subjects and I've just got like 1 C on my transcript, that's going to tank my GPA and decrease my chances of getting into like medical school or whatever. It's the students who are able to ask themselves the question, what can I do differently? How can I get better at this? How can I adapt to this situation? Even if I am bad at math, even if you accept that as true, what can I do about it? Those are the ones who end up succeeding. So if you're a student and you have these like defined qualities of yourself, about yourself, like I am bad at this or I'm good at this, I'm just not a morning person, there may be some truth to that. You may not have quite the gift of mathematics that someone else has. You may have a circadian rhythm that's a little bit harder to control than other people. But that's not the important thing. The important thing is, how can you adapt to that circumstance? Okay, so if I'm not a morning person, how do I need to adjust to make sure that I can perform well on a test that's like scheduled for 8 a.m., right? You have to ask yourself that question. And then that's going to be the first step to like actually figuring it out. So the next thing is communication. So this is where I hate to break it to you, but like students that communicate amongst each other and are good at communication tend to do better than ones that are bad at communication. So I'll give you guys just a couple of examples. So like study groups are really good ways to like anchor you to like forcing you to study. And so what we find is that generally speaking, people who form study groups tend to outperform people who don't. And so a big part of forming a study group is like, because it kind of forces you to study, you show up, other people show up, things like that. So it kind of helps with the issues of procrastination and motivation and stuff like that. But if you really look at it, the formation of a study group really comes down to communication. So one person usually organizes it. Other people are like communicative enough to, kind of like show up and they'll be like, yeah, I'll be there or whatever. And then there's a lot of like informal communication that happens. Some people talk to each other in class and things like that. And as students start to communicate better amongst each other, it also gives them like particular advantages. So like students that are socially well plugged in and have a study group that they show up to on a regular basis, if you're sick or you need notes, like you're much more likely to get them. If you need help or you're struggling with something and you ask for help, which by the way is communication, you're much more likely to like get it, right? Whereas you'll have other students who are not very good at communication. And so if something bad happens, if RNG screws them by getting sick, then their recovery is like way harder than the student who's the good communicator. The other thing that's absolutely OP is that students who are good at communicating will also communicate with their TAs, professors, and that is a huge advantage. So when I'm writing someone a letter of recommendation, it's the communication that the student has had with me that ultimately determines like how good the letter that I write is, right? So like writing a good letter of recommendation as someone who writes them is all about knowing the person, right? So like I can have two people, like if I'm teaching a class and they both get A's, it's even gotten to the point where if someone gets an A in my class, like I won't even write them a letter of recommendation if I don't know who they are. I'll tell them, hey, I don't know who you are. Like all I can really say about you is that you got an A in my class. I can't really say much. So what I've really found, and I don't know if you guys have known this, but like if your professor like knows who you are and you communicate with them, they're also much more likely to give you slack. And this is where you can say that that's unfair, and I'm not saying it is unfair, but unfortunately it's like human. And we as like social animals tend to value like communication and personal relationships. So this is also where like networking comes in. And so we'll talk about that for programmers, but communication is absolutely vital to like like success and performance. In the case of studying, it's about forming studying groups. It's about forming relationships. It's even about communicating your needs and asking for help, because that all falls under communication. The last thing is mindset. So this is where, we talk about this a lot. But generally speaking, when I think about mindset, what I really think about is, things like action orientation versus outcome orientation. That's all up here. So you can do all of the other stuff, right? You can communicate more, you can prepare more, you can adapt more. But what's in here is ultimately going to shape all the other three, okay? So in the case of mindset, like being able to adapt has a lot to do with mindset. Do I understand that like my identity as a human being is not determined by certain outcomes? So if I ask 10 women out and they say no, does that mean that I am a reject or I got rejected by these 10 women? So there's a huge difference there in terms of like, what's your mindset? Is it egotistical? And what I mean by egotistical is not like arrogant, but when things happen to you, do you attribute them to like personal qualities of the self, or do you attribute them to like potentially external factors? So if I ask out 10 girls and like they say no, that may have nothing to do with me. One of them may not be heterosexual. One of them may be in a relationship. One of them may not be looking for a relationship. One of them may have just lost a parent to COVID. One of them may like be racist. Like you never know like what's going on in the other person's mind. And so your mindset and what you identify with in terms of like why things happen to you makes a big difference. Another example of mindset is outcome orientation versus action orientation. So this is a growth mindset versus performance mindset, which Carol Dweck has done a lot of awesome research on. And so the main thing that she sort of discovered, and the yogis discovered this a couple thousand years earlier, is that like people who devote themselves to action as opposed to outcomes are the ones that perform better. So when I focus on studying as opposed to the grade, that actually makes like a big difference in terms of like what happens after the test. So if I am focusing on the grade and I'm shooting for an A and I end up getting a B, if my attitude is, okay, what can I do better? Like, how can I grow from this? Then it's actually going to boost my motivation and I'll try twice as hard on the next test. If I'm focusing on getting an A and I wind up getting a B, it actually tanks my motivation and then I do half as good on the next test. It sort of dooms me to getting a B next time. So mindset, literally with the same result, a different mindset will lead to an increase in motivation or a decrease in motivation. So the other thing in terms of mindset, so for example, when you look at communication, mindset matters there too. So there are some people who will form social connections for like personal gain. And like, that's really what's in their mind. Oh, I need to like form a study group so that if I get sick, people will be able to give me notes. And that's the kind of thing where like you can do that, but I think other people will pick it up. So why are you socializing? What is the nature of your preparation? So even when it comes to communication, like professors are pretty good at picking up, who's a student who's here to just like kiss my ass and brown nose, and who's a student who's here who's genuinely trying to do good in the class and is like trying to learn this subject. And so I've seen this a lot, teaching at Harvard Medical School, because everyone has to do psychiatry. And there are two types of people who are like tryhards at psychiatry, or three types of people who are tryhards at psychiatry. So type number one is like genuinely interested in psychiatry and wants to be a psychiatrist. Tryhard type number two is like wants to be an orthopedic surgeon and needs to get honors in this rotation. So they're going to try really hard for a grade, but actually don't give a crap about psychiatry. And tryhard 3 is actually my favorite kind. Is these are the people who aren't actually interested in psychiatry, like they're not interested in becoming a psychiatrist, but they're genuinely interested in learning it because it's like the last opportunity they'll have to learn psychiatry. Those are actually my favorite students to teach. You don't have to like what I like in order for me to like care about teaching you. All you have to do is like genuinely be interested in the material. So even the mindset that you have will alter your communication, right? You have this linguistic cortex. You have all these empathic circuits in the brain. And so all of those things will essentially act in concert depending on what's on the inside. And if you show up with a study group and your attitude is, hey, like if we all study together, we're going to do better together, right? We can all rise together by working together. Versus joining a study group out of a competitive mindset. And I'm gunning for number one, and I'm going to use you guys to help me get to the top. those two mindsets are going to translate into different kinds of communication and will result in like different things. Because especially like med school is a good example of, half of the people are gunners. Like when I went to med school, at the beginning, I was a gunner too, and I hated it. Like it was like not who I was. And I was like, screw this. Like, because what happens is there's like a medical school honor society, right? And only the top 10% of students get into the honor society. So I was like, I'm going to get in the honor society. I'm going to get in the honor society. And then like it turned me into like a bad person. So I stepped away from it. And then the second year I was like, screw that. I'm just going to like learn medicine. Like I'm going to try to learn medicine. Forget about being at the top of my class. And then, I get an award for academic achievement at the end of 4 years once I change like my mindset. So even mindset can change like all of the other dimensions. We talked about adaptation and how mindset changes that. We talked about preparation. We talked about communication. So the next thing that we're going to do is run through all 4 of these as a programmer. So the first thing is like preparation, right? So depending on how you learn programming and like what are your, avenues of like preparing to be a programmer, that can obviously adjust how successful you are. So for example, if I'm going to program, so, depending on where you train or like whether you do different kinds of certification courses or things like that, some programmers will learn like ancillary stuff. So they'll learn stuff that's a little bit about different from their own field, which I think makes them far more effective programmers. So for example, like even if my job isn't UI UX, but I like spend some time learning about UI UX, it'll probably help me like in my programming because I understand a little bit about UI UX and will help me like talk to people who are doing the UI UX for the back-end stuff that I'm building. Other examples are, a lot of times like people are like, they're almost like bots when it comes to like being a programmer. Like a lot of people, like the difference that I see between the really good programmers and like the mediocre programmers who are still like pretty successful is like some of them behave like bots. So like I'll work with 2 people at, let's say, like just random company, Google, right? And one of the people at Google is like very proactive about programming. They'll like try to learn different things. They'll take like certification courses, things like that. And then another person is sort of like a bot. And what they'll do is they'll like go to work and they'll 9 to 5 it. And then they'll like kind of do their job. They're smart. They're talented. They, studied CS at Stanford. So they're good at it. And then they kind of like leave. And it's not that the other person like works more hours, right? So this isn't like a capitalist, like I'm going to take advantage of people and try to get them to work more. Oftentimes, actually, what I find is that the people who don't behave like bots and are actually thoughtful and spend time like thinking about the job that they're doing, spend time trying to talk to different people in the company, trying to talk to like product developers and things like that, doing different kinds of certification courses, they're actually the ones who become more efficient at programming and can work fewer hours. So preparation can be like kind of, twofold. Either you can prep like a bot, or you can actually be like thoughtful and stop and think a little bit about, how can I become a better programmer? Like, what are the different things that I can do to prepare? The good news is that your bosses will tend to love it because you will do better, but you're not necessarily doing it for the sake of your bosses. You're doing it so that you can become a better programmer. That's like a piece of mindset there, right? So the second thing is to adapt. So this is a good example of actually something that I think that programmers are very good at. So this is something where we'll still talk about adaptation, but I think that programming is one of the few industries that iteration is like a part of what you formally learn, right? And this is going to be, it's kind of weird because if you're a programmer, like I encourage you to talk to other people in industries and you'll discover that you're a lot better at iterating than they are. So as a programmer, you know that when you write code, there are going to be bugs, right? Like you know that from the get-go. So programming is one of the few industries where you write code, there are bugs, you're going to have to rewrite it, and you're going to have to rewrite it, and you're going to have to rewrite it. And this is where, for example, if you compare it to like budding authors will write a first draft or they'll write 3 chapters and they'll say, this thing that I'm writing does not fit the vision of the epic story that I have in my head. So screw it. And they walk away from writing. Right? They go back to their like programming job and they're like, oh, screw this. It's the programmers who understand iteration and even the authors who understand iteration that are the successful authors. There's no such thing as writing a good book. The only thing that you can do is write a crappy book. And then it's through the process of editing and iteration that you write a good book. And so programming has iteration already built in. But this is where when I work with programmers, what I'll have them do is iterate on things besides code, right? So this is where like you can still iterate on things like work-life balance. So, how can you maintain work-life balance? Google is another good example of, they provide meals and things like that. And like some people that I've worked with at Google have like degen sleep schedules and circadian rhythm problems. And like Google sort of doesn't care, right? It's just like you have to write the code by the time that the deadline is there. And what I've really found is that, working with some programmers who like are able to iterate on a good schedule and healthy work-life balance, and the fact that like they're not famished at 2 a.m. because they started work at 10 p.m. and then they're like ordering Uber Eats and then they feel like sluggish or whatever and they're eating crap and then they're like exhausted and it's like this cycle of like just like unproductive stuff. And then they end up drinking tons of Red Bull and like hammering it out towards the end. And since they're brilliant, the code is pretty good and like they end up sticking at Google. But on the flip side, they're the people who are like really, really good at iterating even like personal life stuff or even iterating communication. So I've worked with some, clients that are at some of these companies where you don't even have a job description, right? So these are some of like the open work kind of companies. Like Valve is an example of this kind of company where like you can kind of work on what you want to work on. And, your performance review is essentially like some kind of like peer review. And so when you're I actually don't know if that's precisely what Valve does. I don't know their internal processes, but I've had clients who work at spaces like that, and a lot of programming is turning into that kind of stuff. And so if you kind of think about, how you get promoted, how you get raises, it's not just based on the quality of your work. What you actually have to adapt is like your interpersonal skills and social skills, because part of your raises and benefits, and I could tell stories and stories and stories about the internal workings of these companies. I've also worked with executives who are at these kinds of companies and have this kind of philosophy. So unfortunately, like getting a raise at some of these kinds of companies is like half work product and half popularity contest. And so this is where if you want to adapt, right, there's two kinds of people that I work with. One is like, oh, it's unfair because this person is charismatic, so they got more of a raise than I did. Like sucks. Like it's unfair. Wah. And then there are the people who are like, oh, this is a place where I need to learn social skills, so let me adapt and like learn how to play this game a little bit. Let me learn how to be a little bit more political. And then they're the ones whose performance improves. It's unfortunate that this is the way the world is. I wish it was different, but unfortunately, it's the way it is, right? So now I kind of already segued to communication. But the truth is that if you want to perform in a programming team or, anything else, you need to learn how to be a good communicator. So this is also where, like, if you think about sprints, right? So like a lot of these agile models for like programming involve sprints where people get in a room and they sort of like sit down and they'll like maybe whiteboard things out or things like that. But one of the biggest yields I've seen working with programmers is actually training them in communication skills. Because then what happens is like at the end of like the first sprint meeting or whatever, like everyone understands like what they're supposed to be doing. And when everyone is kind of on the same page, the programming goes much more smoothly. And not being on the same page involves things like not laying out your argument clear enough, not asking questions, not asking other people if they understand. So communication is a huge part of this. So I really do think that like communication is like very important for programmers. And what you'll find is that like, who ends up being the CTO? The CTO, like if let's take 5 programmers, who winds up being CTO? It's not the person who's the best programmer. It's the person who can communicate with the CEO, the COO, and the CFO, right? So like this is really, really important. If you want to be a successful CTO, you need to practice communication skills, because this is what's going to happen. Your CEO is going to come to you and they're going to say, hey, we want this feature. I want to add a button, right? Because they've got this idea. And then like, because they don't understand anything about programming, you as a CTO are going to be like, okay, it'll take us 6 months. Because you've already learned to say we can't do that. Or you've learned that it's wrong to say we can't do that. Well, the truth is you can't do that. It requires some weird back-end architecture stuff that you have to like do from scratch. Right? Because the CEO saw one of your competitors that has an app that added this feature, and they're like, "Oh, that's a cool feature. Like, we should just add the feature, yo." And you're like, so there's the worst CEO who says we can't do that. Then there's like the second level, like one level up from that, is CTO who says, okay, that'll cost us like 6 months and like $500,000. And then the CFO gets pissed at you and they're like, we can't afford that. Like, you need to do it with $250,000. And then the CEO is like, you need to do it in 3 months. And so then they're kind of pissed at you. And then one level above that is like the CTO who can smooth over those things and kind of like massage them into like helping you understand, okay, you do need a bigger budget. Here's why, things like that. And then the highest level of CTO is the one who, when the CEO comes in and says, I want to add this button, is able to say, we can't do that. And the CEO actually respects your opinion and doesn't get pissed at you and listens to you. So like at the bottom and the top, you're saying the same damn thing. It's just one of you in one situation, you actually know how to say that, right? And this is like when I work with CTOs, I'll teach them the skills that I learn as a psychiatrist talking to a suicidal patient, right? And like, you can tell someone who's suicidal, hey bro, you can't do that. That may not work. It's about how you explain to them, how to bring them to your point of view. That's really, really important. So communication is vital in programming and is like so underdeveloped in the field that it's really sad. And so the last thing is mindset. And this is where, this is where things honestly fall apart a little bit for me, because I want to say that like the best programmers that I've worked with actually are like, have this weird kind of mindset of like cynicism and like a defeatist attitude, but perseverance. So there's something, I'd say that the best mindset to have as a programmer is like one where you know things are going to be screwed, but you're going to YOLO it, right? And if you're in programming, like, like it's hard, like this is where I've made observations and I don't quite understand it, to be honest, chat. But there are like some programmers who are like, yeah, let's just YOLO it. And something about that attitude is like, it actually leads to like the best products. I don't understand it. I really don't. And this is where, I wish I could say like, you could talk about action orientation or outcome orientation or things like that. It may have something to do with that. But I think that there's something about, programmers who say this is hard. And maybe it's just like, it kind of goes back to like what we were saying about students, but there's some programmers who are saying this is hard and then they bitch and whine, and like going into it, they have something like the nocebo effect, which is when you believe that a medication isn't going to work, it somehow doesn't work. And so it's the opposite of a placebo. And so there are some programmers who go in kind of thinking like, hey, this is going to fail. It's never going to work. And so like they're malding on the inside and then maybe malding in real life. And they're like grumps and people don't enjoy working with them and they're kind of annoying. And then like it sort of doesn't work out. And then there's another kind of programmer who's got a slightly different mindset, which is like, let's YOLO it. Like this is doomed for failure, but let's see what we can do. Let's try it anyway. And not only does that attitude change the communication, but it also like they just do better. And this is one of the areas where frankly, I probably need to do like a little bit more research, but I've done a lot of mindset work with programmers and I don't know how exactly I've done it, but it seems to work. So some of it is also helping them understand that, your success as a programmer has a lot more to do with like, because some of them will be like hopeless, right? You're one of these cogs in the wheel. The CEO doesn't understand what's going on. The CTO is like riding your ass. The project manager is an asshole and plays favorites. There are all these kinds of attitudes that people have when they go to work. And like, if that's the attitude that you've got when you go to work, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think that the CTO, the project manager is playing favorites, like, then what happens is like, if as long as you hold that attitude in your head, when you make a mistake, like you're not going to think about the mistake you made. You're not going to try to get better. When you make a mistake and some product messes up, you're going to blame the other guy and say that like, oh, they're just blaming you. It's not because I did anything wrong. It's because the project manager is playing favorites. And so you're never going to realize like what you're actually doing wrong and you're never going to actually improve. And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where then the project manager starts to dislike you, because instead of taking constructive feedback and trying to fix things, you just mauled on the inside and like go AFK. So mindset's very important for programmers. Questions? Or actually, before we get to questions. So this is where like, just to summarize, okay? So I've worked with a lot of different people from a lot of different industries. And there are some industry-specific things that you can do for performance, right? If you're Usain Bolt and you're a marathon runner, there's some stuff about the technique of marathon running that may not apply to being a programmer. But what I found is that whether you're a day trader or an esports athlete or a doctor, or a student, there are some things that transcend like industry specifics and lead to like positive performance. Even when working, by the way, even working with prisoners and homeless people, like this stuff is also true in those populations. So it comes down to what I call the 4 pillars of performance. Preparation, which is like how you prepare for the act, right? So how can you optimize your studying? How can you be better at studying? What can you do? It's not just about brute forcing it. More prep does not equal better prep. And so being like careful about the way that you prepare leads to an improvement in performance. The second pillar is adaptation. So some people, when they fail, they attribute their failure to some unchangeable quality. I am alone because I am ugly. This person got promoted because they're more likable than I am. So some people won't try to adapt. They'll just sort of like adopt a fatalistic approach and like won't try to actually change the way that they, are try to perform. The third thing is communication. So this is like, unfortunately, we as human beings are like social creatures, and communication is important. And so whether that's like, forming a study group or giving feedback to your CEO about why their idea is stupid, being a good communicator is like vitally important. And the last thing is mindset, because for whatever reason, what we hold up here translates out into every other aspect of our being in our life, right? The mindset that we have when we play a professional sport, when we play an e-sport, when we sit down to study, when we go into a performance review, when we, what we hold up here shapes so much about our brain. And that actually leads to like noticeable differences in performance. So if you guys, are curious about what I've learned after working with all of these different people, it comes down to preparation, adaptation, communication, and mindset. And if you want to get better, it starts by not being single-minded in these 4 dimensions, right? So it's not just about like studying more, which is the biggest problem. So be good diagnosticians. Take a look at your life and try to ask yourself, are you taking advantage of all 4 of these things? If you're not getting promoted at work, what's your mindset? Are you working on your communication? Or should you just be working more hours? That's the worst thing that you can do. So hopefully this has been helpful. Questions? So someone's saying, what would you say to hard-stuck players in gaming, lower elo? Would likely be your first line of approach? So my first line of approach is to ask yourself why you're hard stuck. And then the second thing is like, remember communication, ask someone else why you're hard stuck, right? Like it's so simple. Like if you're hard stuck at a certain elo, get someone who's a better elo than you and ask them, hey, why am I hard stuck? It's as simple as that. And listen to what they have to say. It's not difficult. It's not complicated. So any thoughts how to deal with a colleague who isn't pulling their weight? Nice enough guy, but very negative mindset and slow worker. So this is kind of interesting because the first thing that I'd say is that like, you shouldn't focus on them. You should focus on yourself, right? So maybe like this is an issue of communication where you may be able to bring something positive out of them. So you can't really control what they do. You can only control what you do. So if you have to pull weight with a worker who's, if you're working with someone who's like not pulling their own weight, there are a lot of different, it's complicated, but I'd start with communication, right? So this is where I think it's important to communicate to the person about your concerns, potentially also communicate to them like to be supportive so that you can like help their negative mindset, ideally. And in some cases, you should also communicate to your boss, right? And this is where like being a skilled communicator is important. So you don't want to throw your colleague under the bus and say, hey, they're not pulling their own weight. You want to go to your boss and you want to have like a problem solving attitude. So this is where like mindset is important, where it's like, you know, how do we fix this? That should be your mindset. Adaptation is important. Like, how do we fix this situation? Because you may not be able to change them. So like, what are the things that, am I going to try to talk to them? Let's say I like try to be nice to them, or I give them praise on like 3 times a week. You start with that. Does that change their negative mindset? Cool. If that doesn't work, maybe give them feedback and say, hey, like, here's my experience of working with you. Like, what do you think about that? And if that doesn't work, then maybe like try going to your boss, right? So you want to kind of like use all of these different things. You want to adapt. You want to try something. You want to communicate. And you want to make sure that in your head, because there could be a mindset here that's getting in the way of you seeing the solution. Oh, I have like a noob for a coworker. As long as you think that way, you're not going to be able to see the best aspects of them, right? So I'll see this like in online multiplayer games, where when people think like, oh, I've got some noob on the team, like GG, and they like AFK because like you can't change this crappy person who's like supporting you and never buys wards. Like that's over because you're not even going to try to help them in any way, shape, or form. You can actually try communicating with them, and you'd be surprised like how effective it is. It may not work all the time, but there in the average MOBA game, there are 4 other people on there, and if you have a positive attitude and try to direct people in a good way, like if someone like feeds and then someone else flames them, you can say like, hey, like you can flame them if it helps you feel better. Like I understand the game is frustrating, and bro, I'm sorry this guy's flaming you. Let's be honest, you're not like really playing the best. Maybe you need some help in your lane. Like, let's think about that. Like, how can we help you, like, come back from this? If you say something like that, it does make a difference. You'd be surprised. So mindset matters, right? So you got to be careful about blaming someone who you think has a very negative mindset and being a slow worker. Like, how can you try to help them? How can you try to support them? Do you have suggestions of resources to improve communication for programmers that aspire to be CTOs or just better communicators? So this is where hopefully we'll have more on this at some point. We're not sure exactly what that looks like. So we've had enough people. So I know we talk about HG coaching as something that like is for degen gamers, but the truth is that half the people who come into coaching or more, maybe 60%, 70%, or even 80%, are like pretty good at something. And we get a lot of really successful programmers. So we had our high performance coaching pilot, which went really, really well. And we had tons of very skilled programmers in our high performance coaching pilot. So the long-term answer is we're actually trying to develop those resources for you because we have discovered that this is a deficiency in most programming education and preparation. The short answer, though, it's not the best answer, but the short answer is sign up for group coaching, because group coaching will at least teach you how to communicate. And so you may not learn quite how to talk to your CEO, but like you'll learn a lot of the fundamentals, right? So just like group coaching, I don't know if you guys get this, but we as human beings don't practice communication. We communicate all day, but we're like bots, right? We just like AFK autopilot our communication. We don't have opportunities for deliberate practice for communication. And the closest thing that we have that exists right now is actually group coaching. So when you go into group coaching, for example, your coach will train you in asking open-ended questions. They'll train you in reflective listening. They'll train you how to understand someone else's perspective in their problem. And the best CTOs are the ones, because here's what you got to understand as a CTO. A CTO has to be like a very good psychiatrist, because someone is going to come to you and they're going to say, this is my vision, make it work. And so the best thing, the most important skill is, I don't know about most important, the most important skill that we teach anyway. The thing that we really help CTOs do is like, how can you ask questions to that person so that their vision is something that you can fully internalize and understand? Because then when you spec out the product, you have to know what's in the mind, like what the vision of like the CEO is, right? You have to spec out the product appropriately. And like speccing out the product involves like understanding like good communication skills. And so what I've seen is like there are good CTOs and there are bad CTOs, and the good CTOs are very intuitive or have learned how to do this kind of on their own. So what I've kind of learned is that like when I work with a CTO, like I'll teach them some of the techniques that I use in communication. And the closest offering that we have is frankly group coaching. Because group coaching, like you're going to have a bunch of people who have thoughts that you don't understand. And you're going to practice like asking those people thoughts and like understanding their perspective. And then that's a highly transmissible skill. So what we tend to find in people who do group coaching is like their communication overall improves in many dimensions of their life. That's part of the reason why I think we see this phenomenon in group coaching, that all boats rise together. So when people go to group coaching, you know, it's not 100%. But what we see is that people will like improve in their interpersonal relationships. They'll improve at school. They'll improve in a sense of like having control over their life. We unfortunately don't have data about some of these things. So we're also refining our data collection methods and stuff. We do know that, for example, depression and anxiety are getting better. And it's my instinct that the reason that those are getting better is because people's job performance is getting better. They like their job more. They're doing better at their job. They're communicating more with their boss. They're letting their partners know what their needs are. They're also like understanding their partner's needs better. So group coaching is kind of the best that we've got right now, but there's a lot that can be done better than group coaching. There are some of these things like communication trainings and stuff like that, but I think that the big problem with a lot of those is that they don't really they're not practice oriented, they're like information oriented. So this is the other thing that y'all have to understand, which is part of the reason why like Healthy Gamer we do like coaching plus information like streaming. Because it's been my experience that watching cooking videos does not make you a chef, right? It's like the environment to practice, which is really, really important. So when it comes to communication skills, part of the reason that we have a group coaching program, right? Because there's tend to be some spots available in group coaching, but personal coaching always fills up. And the reason for that is because of our belief that like you need an arena to practice these things. And so that's why we have streams and then like we have group. That's why we combine Dr. K's guide, which is like expert information, with the ability to like practice those things and like apply them and work through those things in a group setting. So a lot of people will say like, oh, I don't know what my dharma is or my purpose. I feel like I have no purpose. How do I find purpose? And that's where like when you do group coaching, I can tell you, hey, do this exercise, like write one page about what you think is wrong with the world. And that's a step in the right direction, but it's not like 90% of people who do that exercise suddenly have 33% more purpose in their life. But you know, the average improvement in purpose, I think with group coaching is about 33%. So just think about that for a second. We have like so many posts on our subreddit and so many people, like even people who are successful, who are like, I don't know what I'm doing here. Like they can be successful. They can be successful programmers. And they're like, I don't know what I'm doing with my life. And the truth is that if you want to understand what you're doing with your life, you have to like work at it, right? It's something that introspection has to be like worked on and practiced. And the cool thing about group coaching is when you go in and you say something like that, you know, you're going to have other people and then all y'all are going to try to problem solve together. So we've designed group coaching with some of these pillars of performance in mind. It's iterative, right? It changes the way that you try to answer these questions. We're changing the way that you try to answer the question of what to do with your life. You can listen to podcasts, you can watch stream, but at the end of the day, when you have someone who's a skilled questioner or a group of people who are skilled questioners, personal coaching works for this too, and you go in and you say, I don't know what to do with my life, and they start asking you questions and they start like interviewing you and pulling bits of information out of you, when they get to know who you are over the course of 12 weeks, you will wind up, or the data suggests that about 6,000 people see an average improvement of 33% more purpose. Now, remember that there are some people who don't see an improvement in purpose, which also means that there are some people who see like 50% improvement, 60% improvement, 70% improvement, because it's an average. And what I've observed in group coaching is that the average really, like, there's a variance there, right? And a lot of like that average also depends on people's like adaptability and their mindset when they come into coaching. So are they coming in with the idea that they're going to get like a set of tips? They're going to get life hacks and like a curriculum, which is going to fix their life. If they come in with that attitude and they hold on to that attitude, they don't get a whole lot out of it, right? So what we do in group coaching is help pull the answers out of you. The answers are in there. They got to be pulled out. Maybe one more question. Okay. This is sounding like an ad for group coaching now. But, okay. So this is just too funny, though. Maybe it's just top of mind. How can one conquer shyness and fear of saying something dumb when and becoming more noticeable in the team at work? You practice conquering shyness and fear of saying something dumb in a place outside of work, which is literally how group coaching helps social anxiety. So we'll have people with social anxiety come into group coaching and they won't say anything. So then like what the coach, we train them in this, right? So the coach is going to like observe and say like, hey, have y'all noticed that these 3 people aren't talking and these 3 people are talking too much? What should we do about that as a group? So the coach isn't going to say, they may do this a little bit, but they're not going to tell the 3 people to be quiet and the 3 people to talk. They're not going to do that because that actually doesn't build the skill. They're going to point it out to the group. Because here's the other thing. You're talking about the people who are shy. The 3 people who are talking all the time are the ones that are fucking annoying at work and always open their mouth and like even when they're not supposed to. So there are communication problems on both ends of the spectrum. And group is a place where you will literally practice feeling anxious, not wanting to speak. And like people are going to help you overcome that anxiety. And on the flip side, there are going to be people who talk too much and talk without thinking. And they're going to practice learning how to listen. And then when they go to work, they're going to like know how to listen. And they're going to realize, oh crap, listening is OP. I should be doing this more. People like me more when I learn how to listen. Right? And so like the coach will facilitate that growth. But I want you all to understand this. It's not like you guys are asking informational questions, right? You're asking like, and I'm going to give you like an answer that's just information. But the information won't necessarily change your behavior. It's a very low likelihood that the information will change your behavior. So this is why, we're also hoping to study this. But, I don't know how many lives get transformed through watching YouTube. I mean, if you look at our subreddits and stuff, like apparently lives do get transformed. So yay for us. That's why we continue doing it. But the truth is that it's far more reliable to like have a space for deliberate communication practice. And the interesting thing, I'm talking about, group coaching, but people who've been through group coaching may not even realize that this is what we're doing. So I don't know like how many people in group coaching even understand that this is the mechanism through which their improvement is happening. That's not what it feels like to them. They don't even realize we're teaching them this stuff. We just teach them. Right? We're going to just we're going to give you salt and we're going to have you taste the soup and we're going to let you figure out what to do with it. We're not going in and saying, hey, here's how you make soup. We're just going to give you all the pieces and give you like a sandbox to like practice and learn and become comfortable with the skill. Okay, I'm supposed to crap. I'm almost done for the day. So I've got a group of subreddit posts to respond to. Okay, chat, we're going to speed run some Reddit, okay? This took way longer. Okay. So, can't live a life because of my social anxiety, and can't seek treatment because of social anxiety. So social anxiety is like kind of tricky, okay? So part of the reason that mental illness is so bad is because I kind of think about it almost like I think about HIV. So the reason that HIV is such a devastating illness is because it impacts your ability to fight back, right? So if we look at all of the illnesses, in most of them, you have an immune system that's fighting against the illness. The problem with a lot of mental illness is that we use our minds to fight back. We use our minds to adapt. Like if you look at like cancer survivors, for example, right? Like they use their mind, they're resilient, they seek help, they go see doctors, they like, if their mind is like working okay, like they will like go and like they can fight against the cancer because their weapons are still intact. The most devastating thing about a lot of psychiatric illnesses, like if you look at depression or social anxiety, is that they actually attack your ability to fight back. So the hardest thing about social anxiety is that it's hard to go get help. So this is where, if you look at people, so I'm going to take a quick tangent. So there are like 2 personality disorders. One is avoidant personality disorder, and the other is schizoid personality disorder. So in avoidant personality disorder and schizoid personality disorder, people are loners. But there's a big difference. So avoidant people who are also kind of on the social anxiety kind of bucket, in my mind, are people that want connections but can't get them. And schizoid people are just loners. So they're actually like content being alone. So the tricky thing about social anxiety is that you want connections, or if you have avoidant personality disorder, or if you're like avoidant, right? You want connections, but it's just really, really hard to get them. And that's just what's so devastating about it, because like, you know, you want the connection, you want to seek help, but you're so damn socially anxious that overcoming that social anxiety is like half the problem. So then the question is, okay, what do I do if I'm socially anxious and I can't get into therapy? And this is where the short answer is ask for help. So if you can't do something on your own, and by the way, if you want to think about one variable that correlates with success in life, I think it's the ability to ask for help. And so if you can't get a therapist on your own because you're too socially anxious, you know, I would say just ask for help. And then the people with social anxiety may fire back and they may say, but like asking for help makes me anxious too. And that's where like, yeah, that's true. But this is where, in my experience, even people with social anxiety or even people who are avoidant have some people that they can ask for help. There are some people that they can reach out to that they feel comfortable enough, like asking for help. So it's something as simple as asking, you know, a friend of yours, like, hey, can you help me find a therapist? And even go to the first appointment, like with someone who's got social anxiety. So sometimes I'll have, you know, patients who will come to like their first appointment with me and they'll like bring a friend or bring a pet, like, and they'll ask, you know, can I bring a pet? And sometimes I have to say no, but depending on where I'm renting space. But sometimes they'll come in and then I'll say like, you know, if it makes you comfortable and they're, you know, you're okay with them like hearing what I answer about medical questions, then they're welcome to come in. Is it okay if I ask them to stay out for a little while? Or step out for a little while. So I'd say, in short, ask for help from people that you're comfortable with. And there may be some amount of social anxiety there, but this is also where like, you know, the social anxiety you have to overcome to go see a therapist may be over here, but the social anxiety to ask a friend for help may be over here. It's still going to be present, maybe. And then hopefully you have like a really good friend that you feel comfortable asking for help, and just ask for help. So ask them to help you, you know, like look through things, make appointments, make phone calls. Maybe you're comfortable doing all the research, but you're not comfortable making the phone call. I've even done that for family members and stuff, where like I'll even talk to like, I'll have some family members who are like very reluctant to engage in like mental health treatment, or some very close friends, and I'll make the phone calls for them. And I'll put it on speakerphone and I'll say, hey, let me make the phone call for you. So I'm going to call the number, because like making appointments not actually that hard. Right? It's not like that difficult of an interaction. It's not like people are going to grill you. And so, you know, I'll make the phone call for them. And even in coaching, one of the things that our coaches are actually trained to do is to help people overcome their resistance and operationalize getting into therapy. So we even give the coaches like sort of a guide to help their clients get into therapy. Because sometimes coaching, you know, sometimes people really do have, while coaching can improve depression and anxiety, sometimes it appears that the coach can't really diagnose things, but they may really like notice, they'll be like, okay, it really seems like, you know, something's off here and you're having a lot of trouble getting out of bed in the morning. Why don't you get a mental health evaluation to see if this is depression? So they're kind of trained in that. So I'd say the short answer is like, ask for help if you can't do it on your own. If my mom doesn't want to do therapy because she doesn't believe in it, should I make the appointment for her? No. So you shouldn't do something that someone is resistant to. Remember, the scenario that we're talking about here is this one, which is can't live a life because of my social anxiety, can't seek treatment because of my social anxiety. But this person is interested in seeking treatment. They just can't, or it's difficult for them. That's different from someone being resistant. So this is where we did a communication kind of like seminar, right? Like how to convince people of things, which is after the Jimmy from Philly episode. So if you guys, I'd encourage y'all to check those two things out. So like I explained some basics about communication and how to convince people of stuff. And then you can also watch the Jimmy from Philly thing. I'm going to be right back. I need to grab some water. Okay. Let's keep going. So we'll do like one more. Okay. So let's take a look at this one. From happy with my life to it doesn't seem so happy after all. I, 27M, used to be happy with my life. I was a hippie, happy, optimistic guy who was always eager to help anyone. And that was what I identified with. I also like to listen to self-help books and extracted the part that fit me and gave me a feeling of I'm doing great. Then about 2 months ago, I listened to No More Mr. Nice Guy, and that just described me so well, and I realized that my helpfulness and everything seems to be some kind of coping mechanism. And in the time following, I thought a lot about it and realized some things. The times I cried since childhood are few and far between, and usually only in very emotional situations. And when I feel like crying, there's some kind of roadblock, so I don't cry. I feel like I'm not in touch with my emotions. I think I somehow shut them down when they arise, but since thinking about it, it got better, even if it's negative emotions like sadness or anger. I never had a person with whom I shared my deep emotions, maybe because I never felt them or never trusted a person enough. I have no goals in life. I feel like I should be further in life. I have a bachelor in a creative field, but I started another one in engineering, and I'm not sure if it's because I wanted to or because of my parents. I'm interested in the topics, but something feels off. In the last month, in between semesters, I had no drive to do anything except to go for a walk sometimes. Also, I realized that I might have a porn addiction. Does anybody have some advice? Thanks for letting me share, and greetings from Germany. So this is a really common problem, okay? So let's start by summarizing what this problem is. There are some people out there who try to be good people, and they try to be like nice people, right? And they try to be like so helpful because like that's what you're supposed to do. Like to have value in life, I need to be like really nice and like help other people. And sometimes these people turn into nice guys that let other people, run circles around them. They're so interested in being helpful and being a good person that they like let other people take advantage of their kindness. A lot of times these people also feel like support characters, right? You're like the hireling. You're not the protagonist. You're like, friendly dude number 2 in the story. And they feel like they have no purpose in life. They don't know what they want. And so they're just trying to be good people because they don't know like kind of what else there is. So if I had to sort of come up with a phrase to diagnose this constellation of symptoms, and you'll also find that, I feel like numb, I feel, disconnected from my emotions, I have no purpose in life. By the way, I have a porn addiction. This is what I'd call like spiritual numbness, for lack of a better term, or even like emotional numbness. So there's a group of people out there who have a set of features. So one is like toxic positivity. So toxic positivity has all kinds of manifestations, but oftentimes it means like a self-help addiction, a desire to be helpful for others, a desire to like be a really good person. Like you have an idea of like what a good person is and you really strive towards it, right? So spiritual numbness kind of has this toxic positivity, which is like, I'm a help people. I'm going to get better. I'm going to be like, I'm going to grow. I'm going to improve. Sometimes it's kind of like this toxic, like if you're not growing, you're dying kind of attitude, So this is the first thing that is sort of a sign of spiritual numbness. The second thing is that sometimes they almost always have some kind of other maladaptive coping mechanism along with it. So either they have a substance use disorder or they have a porn addiction or something like that. They have something going on that allows them to numb the negative stuff, right? So what I'm going to do is like use some kind of neuroscientific coping mechanism to numb all of my negativity, and then I'm going to paint on top of it a mask of positivity and goodness and self-help and growth and being a good person. And then the third thing that's a very common sign is no purpose. And then when they have no purpose, the symptom of that, what that looks like, is this, I have a creative arts degree and now I'm studying engineering because, I don't know what to do with my life. So when they have no internal sense of purpose, their mind fills it in with like a logical idea of what would be good to do in theory. So I've heard this story so many times. I have a creative writing degree, and now I'm going back to become a programmer. Now I'm going back to be engineering school because like I don't have any passion, so I might as well choose the pragmatic choice. So if you fit into these kinds of situations, so if you have this case of spiritual numbness where you have some dimension of toxic positivity, right? Like either you're overly helpful, you know, or you read a bunch of self-help stuff, or you're like obsessed with growth, right? Or you've got this porn addiction on the side sort of thing. Like I've got, oh, by the way, I smoke pot every day, like, or like something else, something to cope with your negative emotions and bury them. And the third thing is that you've got like no sense of purpose. So you kind of fill up your life with what would be good to do. Look, like your life becomes a life of shoulds instead of passions. You have no passion, so it's just like, I should do this. I should do this. Let me just do this kind of stuff. But then you're kind of like internally, you're like a zombie. You become like a bot in life, right? Like you're just like, so then the question becomes, okay, like what do you do if you've got these problems? So the first thing to understand is that where do goals come from? Where do real goals come from? Where do goals that people like strive and struggle and have passion for, where do they come from? They come from the inside, right? When you think about like people who are really successful and really motivated and like have a vision for what they want to do in life, they're not emotionally numb. They're in touch with their internal like self. So this is where you've got to understand that you can't be emotionally like the emotional coping mechanism of numbness results in having no purpose. So the more that because this is an interesting thing about, you know, the human brain, is that when we numb ourselves out, we numb everything. We numb the positive and the negative. So when you look at like why heroin is so addictive, heroin like is like obliviates like everything within you, right? It just like takes everything away, and then you just float around in this kind of like neutral pleasantness that feels really, really good. You know, some people sort of almost describe enlightenment or samadhi kind of in the same way, where you're getting rid of like all positivity and all negativity. And so, or in samadhi, it's a little bit different because they're present, but you can be detached from them. So the tricky thing is that as long as you're using numbing mechanisms to protect yourself against the negative, you will result in burying the positive with it. It's just like, we're going to bury all of the emotions. And you can't selectively bury the negative stuff. And that sort of results in this toxic positivity, right? Where like, now that I've sort of buried everything, what I'm going to try to do is just let the positive stuff out. So it's not actually, you're not letting genuine positivity out. You're letting this painted, fake, false mirage of positivity like fill up your conscious mind. And then what these people do is they literally bombard their sense organs with like false positivity. So they'll read self-help books. They'll hang out with people who can let them feel helpful, even though that's a toxic one-sided relationship, right? That's what a big part of No More Mr. Nice Guy is about. So these are like nice guys who get friend zoned. So what's going on there? It's like, I'm going to bury all of my negativity and real feelings and stuff like that. And I'm going to fill it up instead with like trying to be helpful, and I'm going to try to get someone to like me. And so when you kind of do that, you feel positive, like your mind has this intellectual idea of like, oh, I'm a good person, I'm helpful, they'll like me. And so this is where like all three of these things chain together, and I've seen this scenario time and time and time again. I've seen it in people who are, 27 and going nowhere in life. I've seen it in people who are 50 and very successful and very wealthy. I've seen it in people who are 23 and just got their first big job at like a prestigious investment bank like Goldman Sachs. It's something that transcends a given situation. So then the question is kind of like, okay, so what do I do about it, right? So the first thing is you've got to learn how to feel. Like that's the underlying thing that causes all of the stuff to kind of tumble down. So the purpose will come once you get in touch with yourself. And so we have to think about, okay, how do we learn how to feel? And that's where like, boy, do people hate this. You got to stop smoking pot, right? So like, I'll get so many people who come in and they'll say like, oh, I have no purpose in life. Like I read a bunch of self-help stuff, and I'll be like, do you smoke pot? And they're like, what does that have to do with it? And they get super defensive. You got to stop smoking pot. The first thing that you've got to do is work on the coping mechanism that is numbing you. Because as long as you're numbing your internal self, like, you're not going to be able to discover your purpose. And I think this is what the folks over at NoFap have figured out, right? So the reason that NoFap exists is because some people have figured out that, like, when they can successfully NoFap, that their life starts to get way better in a lot of different ways. Like, they start to discover purpose, they start to become, like, better at stuff and things like that. It doesn't happen for everyone. Because I think NoFap it's not necessarily about the celibacy. I think it's about dealing with the coping mechanism that's actually holding you back. So the thing about these negative coping mechanisms is that they stabilize you, right? So they help you move to numbness. So that's protective because it protects you from the negative, but it also holds you back in terms of moving towards the positive. So you got to start with the coping mechanism. So this is where, if you have something like a porn addiction, that's the first thing I'd try to tackle. We have some resources about that kind of stuff. You guys can check out the streams and things like that. You can go see a therapist. You have to work on the coping mechanism. You got to cut back on the gaming, cut back on the social media, cut back on the Reddit. And this is where, like, doing dopamine detoxes, getting off of porn addiction, getting sober, all that stuff is, like, really, really important. Once you do that, you'll start to feel a little bit, right? And so then you're kind of on the right track. The other thing about the toxic positivity is you have to let other people dislike you. So this is something that can be very, very intolerable. But a lot of the reason that people become doormats is because they're unable to tolerate the dislike of others, right? And it's really, really interesting. But these people will kind of, like, they just won't be able to tolerate being disliked. So when I like someone or I'm interested in someone, so this is what No More Mr. Nice Guy is about. When I'm attracted to someone, I can't tolerate the idea of them disliking me. And so this is where you say, okay, like, how do you do that? Just start tolerating dislike. It's hard. So you can work with a therapist, work with a coach. You can do a lot of introspection. But this is the key. This is the foundation of learning how to tolerate dislike. So it starts with awareness. Remember this, okay? So this is what's going to happen. You're going to want to do something nice for someone else, right? And then I want you to stop before you do that thing and ask yourself, like, why am I doing this? Like, what's the big driver? If I don't do this thing, what do I think will happen? Am I okay with what happens if I say no to this? If I go against my impulse, am I okay with the consequences? So here's a good example. Let's say I give my friend a ride to the airport, and then I ask them, hey, can you give me a ride to the airport? And they say no. And then a few weeks later, they ask me, hey, can you give me a ride to the airport? As you're about to say yes, pause for a second and ask yourself, like, wait a minute, why am I saying yes here? Am I saying yes because I genuinely, like, want to help this person? Or am I saying yes because I'm afraid of what they will do if I say no? And then, like, notice that thing first. Because there's this really important principle that, like, once you notice something, then you can actually, like, act on it. So someone is saying pause, champ, and that is exactly correct. And so this is where you may need a little bit of, like, coaching, right? So if they ask you in that moment, you have to learn how to say originally, like, prep this answer. Or hopefully they'll text it to you because everyone texts nowadays. You can say, hey, I'm not sure, let me get back to you. And even if that's hard for you to do, if you can't say, I'm not sure, let me get back to you, then you have found your problem. Okay? So it starts with awareness. And then, like, you just have to explore those feelings, right? And so as you explore those feelings, like, by all means, bring it up in group or, like, talk to a coach or, like, talk to your friends or journal or talk to a therapist or whatever. Explore those feelings. And as you explore those feelings, you'll undo the numbness, right? It's not necessarily, don't worry, I'm not saying you don't have to cave and give them a ride to the airport. It's about uncovering the numbness. So inquire, understand yourself, explore a little bit. And then the numbness will get a little bit better. And then as you become, like, improved in terms of numbness, then you'll be in touch with your feelings more. You'll start to recognize that you feel resentful towards this person. And once you recognize the resentment can actually fight being a doormat. And the resentment is going to be like, actually, don't give into this. And we kind of talk about feeling resentment as, like, a bad thing, but, like, resentment can work for you. Remember that there are no good feelings and there are no bad feelings. They're just all feelings, right? This is the yogic perspective, that feelings are neither good nor bad. It's just about understanding them. So that's how you kind of start to unravel this, right? So if you're one of these people who's spiritually numb, as evidenced by not knowing what you want to do in life and filling up your life with pragmatic side quests, and also trying to help other people because you've got no other purpose in life, and also resulting in like kind of feeling numb, have a slow playing addiction on the side, and maybe I'm a little bit of a doormat and have trouble saying no to people. This is all an issue of spiritual numbness. So in order to unravel that, you have to start by feeling and start by understanding why you behave the way that you do. So look at your interactions. Ask yourself, am I avoiding dislike? Is other people disliking me like really hard for me to tolerate? So as you begin to introspect and uncover those negative emotions, and as you start to tolerate those negative emotions, because as you uncover them, you'll learn how to tolerate them, right? Because then they're sitting there and you're like, you're the one who's opening up the box. So that's how you learn how to tolerate it. You open it up yourself. Slowly, as you do this kind of work, you'll stop being a nice guy. You'll start to figure out what you want to do. And you'll start to figure out, like, you'll start to be able to accept that you have resentment. You'll even channel that stuff for the positive. That's what you do. Thanks for the subs, Dino Nuggies. So listen, I got to bounce, chat. It's been fun. I was hoping to get to a couple other questions, but maybe we'll get to those tomorrow. It's been an absolute blast talking to y'all and checking in with everyone. Love y'all, chattars. And who should we stream? I mean, who should we raid? That's the main thing. I have so many Twitch points. Hey, so I've also heard that Twitch is about to become pay to win. So how do y'all feel about that? Y'all want to raid Gorp? How long in EU? I'm in EU through TI. I can say that now. Let's raid Big Moist. Moist Critical? Sure. We can... Moist or Gorp? Raid Banana? Banana Slam Jamma, right? We can raid BSJ. Moist? Okay, everyone's saying Moist. So we're going to raid Moist. I think I spelled that right? Yeah, there we go. All right. So love y'all. Hopefully, I'm going to actually try to stream tomorrow. So if I can, I'll stream tomorrow. So I'll see you guys tomorrow. I don't think we're going to set up an interview or anything. We may do actually, we're trying to decide. Either I'll do a subreddit review and we'll answer more questions, maybe do a little bit more teaching about performance, or we may do something like psychoanalyzing Squid Game, but that's going to be full of spoilers. So you guys let me know, what y'all want. What do you guys think about that idea? Y'all have what do you guys want? Q&A? Okay, we'll see. Okay, we'll see. Because we may need higher production value to do that kind of thing. Because you have to illustrate. So I don't know if it's best to do over stream. But okay, cool. Love y'all. I'll see y'all hopefully tomorrow, okay? We'll see if we can put it together from a production value standpoint. But I'm not sure if we can pull that together. Take care.